All right, so how you guys doing today? Good, good.
We are great. Glad that you're here, Sean.
That's what I like to hear. So as you can see today, I'm here to talk about internet partner violence. So my name is Sean Shutt. I'm the Community Engagement and Prevention Manager for the Underground Railroad. Just to add this in here, I have no financial conflicts or interests to disclose. I get paid through my work, and that's about it. And then the information discussed in this presentation might be difficult for some people, so please just keep that in mind as you're listening today to please also take care of yourself. So as we get started, before we run into the actual presentation, I do like to run through just a little bit of Underground Railroad and what our services are for those of you that may be unfamiliar. So at Underground Railroad, we help victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. And we serve all victims of all gender identities within Saginaw County. Now, if somebody is not within Saginaw County, we're not going to just kick them out the door and say, sorry, good luck, you're on your own. We will work with other organizations to try to connect them to what resources will work the best for them in that moment. We have a 24-hour helpline, which is open, obviously, any time of the day or night for people to call in if they may be in a bad situation, want to know what one could look like, or if they think their friend is going through something, they can call to figure out the best way to help or support that person. Like I said, we have an emergency shelter, and this is for victims to stay if they are in a situation where they need to be in shelter because their only other option would possibly be going to a place that could be dangerous for them. We have court support programs, as well as counseling, advocacy, and support groups for those who are in shelter and those who are outside of shelter as well. So if somebody still wants to be a therapist or counselor, but they don't need the emergency shelter, they're still able to meet with that counselor or that therapist or join our support groups. We have children's and youth services as well. So in our shelter, we have a daycare that is certified to the state of Michigan for victims to use. We have housing support programs. So when someone is living in our shelter, we have housing advocates who will work with them to try to find housing back out into the community. So once their stay in our shelter is up, they have somewhere else to go that is going to be more homey for them. And so that way they don't have to go back to the person who was abusing them in the first place.
Sheila, do you have a question?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I can't see faces.
I will do that. No worries.
Yeah. Yes, I have a question. I was wondering if someone is from a different county than where you are in Saginaw, are they able to do this, or is this just for Saginaw residents?
Yeah, so we primarily serve Saginaw County, so any city within the county of Saginaw. But like I said, if someone shows up and they're a victim and they're not from Saginaw County, we're not just going to say good luck, you're on your own.
Okay.
If they need emergency shelter, we will work with them, obviously, to try to find them either space in our shelter or at another shelter that we work closely with, because we do connect with a lot of the ones nearby as well. We've had people drive victims down to Detroit over to Grand Rapids as well. So we will work with them where they're at. But we primarily serve Saginaw County just because there are resources very similar to ours in Bay City and Midland. But yeah, we will still work with them. We're not going to just say good luck, you're on your own.
What is your hotline number?
Answer that question. Let me grab our brochure. The helpline number is 989-755-0411. The toll-free number version of it is 888-399-8385. And you could also text our text line, which is 989-770-8892. Because we know there's people like me who absolutely hate calling.
989-770-8892.
Correct.
Okay, I'm just adding it in the notes for people.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have Safe Place, which is for safe exchange and visitation. So if a court has mandated that one of the parents needs to be supervised while visiting with their kids, they can do that at Safe Place. Or if they just need somewhere to exchange their kids for that weekend or week-long visit, they can do that there instead of some weird random parking lot. And then we also do community outreach, which is my main job, as well as my prevention work. And then the other two things on there is so it's actually just Underground Railroad resale now. I forgot to change that part of this presentation because this is a bit older. But it's our resale store, which is one of the ways that we actually make money to provide services for victims, other than just through grants or donations. And then Pause for Hope is just our pet shelter. We have a pet shelter in our shelter for victims so they can bring their pets with them, because we know that's often a barrier that might keep them in the relationship. So we want to try to reduce as many barriers as possible. Any questions about underground services before we get started? I realize I ran through those kind of quick. All right. So when we're looking at domestic violence, the main definition that we use is going to be a pattern of behaviors used to gain power or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. Basically, they're using these tactics to try to control what their partner is doing or have some kind of power over them. Keeping in mind that that is also always going to be the root cause of abuse, is one person's desire for power and control over their dating partner, or a belief that they have more power or control over them. So looking at legal definitions, you're not going to get arrested for calling a partner a bad name, but emotional abuse does still fall under our definition to maintain or gain power and control. But if we're looking from a legal standpoint, physical assault and criminal behaviors are usually the things that they're going to be looking for if they're going to try to prosecute somebody for committing domestic violence. And then public health definitions, it includes that emotional and physical abuses, social isolation or stalking, so trying to cut that person off from their friends or their family, as well as then stalking them to try to keep tabs on them. Intimidation and threats, again, using these things to really kind of control or dictate what that person does, or make them feel like their only option is to do the thing to avoid the threats or possible harm. Reproductive coercion, so removing birth control, things like that, getting that person pregnant, or conversely forcing that person to terminate a pregnancy, and then sexual assault and coercion as well. So all of those things underneath the public health definitions are various forms in which somebody can use to gain power and control over someone else. Which I know is a lot, but don't worry, I will explain those more in depth in a little bit. But what I want to point out is when we think of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, generally what ends up getting portrayed and what we see is like things on the left here. The person who is beaten, is bloody, because many people, when they think of domestic violence, their first thing they think of is, oh, physical abuse. We know not all abusive relationships end up being physically abusive, but many of them will have, most, if not all, will have some form of emotional abuse that is taking place because they can't start off being physically abusive. So when we're looking at what we really see, and again, I can't see people, but how many of you have seen the movie The Invisible Man? It's considered a horror movie, and it being spooky season as well as being a horror movie buff, The Invisible Man is a phenomenal film. The main reason is this movie does a very good job of showing what domestic violence looks like while also showing the impacts on that victim in a way that we don't normally see it. The Invisible Man is somebody who is always there. He's ever present in her life. And you can see that in how victims respond to that trauma as well, where because they've experienced trauma, there are things that might be triggering to them in their day-to-day lives now because of something that their partner had done to them. So this movie does kind of show how she processes that trauma, despite also the ever-present Invisible Man actually being physically there, just invisible. So it really kind of shows more of, we need more representation like what we see in The Invisible Man to help people understand that domestic violence is not just physical. There's going to be emotional and social abuses where they're going to be cut off from friends and family, or where they're always going to have they're going to be feeling like they might not be good enough because that is what their partner kept telling them. The impacts on their self-esteem are going to typically be said to be far greater than the physical abuse that they went through. Bones will heal, bruises will heal, but the self-esteem hit that many victims experience can last far longer. So just some data, because I know some people are nerds and like data like me. Nearly 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men in the US reports experiencing violence by a current or former spouse or partner at some point in their lifetime. 60% of victims will never disclose the abuse to anyone else. Intimate partner violence is the leading cause of injury to women specifically. Half of all homeless women and children are fleeing domestic violence, and Underground Railroad, we serve over 4,000 individuals every year. So all of that to say that when we are looking at intimate partner violence in our communities, the odds are we have all interacted with somebody who has experienced domestic violence at some point during their lifetime. Now, the at risk, or the people who are the most at risk for domestic violence, though, we are also interacting with, I believe, oh, I'm jumping ahead. Before we jump into those who might be the most at risk for domestic violence, the cycle of abuse was a tool that was often used to help victims or help people understand what an abusive relationship may look like. So they would talk about, well, there's a honeymoon period where they're going to be really loving and caring, give them gifts, and then it moves into that tension building section where there's going to be the criticism, the yelling, the screaming, coercion to do things, some anger, and then it moves into the explosion where the quote unquote actual abuse happens, where it's going to be those attacks and threats, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual. They then go back and they apologize, hits that honeymoon period again, and it continues on in this cycle. This is a tool that's not used as often anymore because there's a better tool to use, which I'll talk about next, but also because this isn't the reality for all victims of domestic violence. While this might be the reality for some, so this tool may be useful, especially in a kind of therapy setting for a victim, to say like, oh yeah, nope, that is what I've experienced. So it can help them understand that. But the issue came from if this was not the reality for them, where there wasn't the honeymoon period to tension building to explosion, back to the honeymoon period and so on, it would be easy for a victim to say like, well, that's not my experience, so that means I must not be experiencing domestic violence. So when you're working with someone, just kind of understanding what tools will work the best for them. And the tool that I like the most, despite being a social worker or not being a social worker, is the power and control wheel. Because if any of you are social workers or have worked with them, you understand that they love wheels for some reason. So this power and control wheel does a good job of kind of explaining the different types of behaviors that a victim may experience in their abusive or their unhealthy relationship. So I will eventually go through all of these ones, but the one thing I want to point out on here is I don't like the using male privilege section on here just because we know that men can be victims as well. So if you were to use this wheel with a man and then he sees using male privilege, well, he's not experiencing male privilege by being abused by his partner. So he might then deem this tool not usable. So there is one that says using privilege, which is the one I tend to use more often, but I forgot to update this. So going on to talking about those risk factors. So these are behaviors that victims are going to experience, but there are those in our community who are at a greater risk to experience these things. And the way we can figure that out is using our social determinants of health. I have a master's degree in public health, so I'm a nerd when it comes to the social determinants of health. Don't worry, I won't spend the entire presentation discussing them, but what I want to discuss with them is understanding that the social determinants of health help us understand who are the most at risk in our communities, because what they do is they show those whose identities are putting them in, or identities have placed them in a position in that community where they're going to have a greater impact on their overall health outcomes. So basically what I mean by that is it's not really what they were born with, but it's how they're treated in their community because of what they were born with or what they have. So when you're looking at income level, are they of upper class, lower class, or middle class? As you can probably imagine, somebody who is of lower class may be a bit more at risk to experiencing domestic violence than somebody who is of upper class. Now, I also want to make it clear, it is at the bottom of the slide, but as I am talking through these, I am not saying that somebody who is of upper class cannot be a victim of domestic violence. Domestic violence does not discriminate in terms of anyone can be a victim of it. but there are groups of people who are at a greater risk for it based on their identities. So what's their education level? How far in school did they go? What is their literacy level, or can they even read? What is their sexuality? So how does their community view them based on what their sexual orientation is? Or what is their gender identity? How does the pressures that we put on femininity and masculinity impact their overall health? Or how does their community view them based on what their gender identity is? Or do they even feel safe in their own communities to be able to express themselves the way that they want? What is their racial identity? So what is their race or ethnicity? What is their immigration status? Were they born here, or did they have to migrate into into the country? Do they have previous victimization? What is their religion or their spirituality? So these are just some of the social categories that somebody can fall into, and every single one of us has one of these things. Every single one of us has an income level. We all have an education. We all have a sexuality. We all have a gender identity. We all have a racial identity. We all have a hair color or a hairstyle, even if that's no hair at all. And then looking at those, that can paint a picture then to see who we have marginalized in our communities. And once we have marginalized them, it makes it more easy for us to overlook them. So the example I use is like those of us who have glasses can probably understand, like your vision just outside of your central frame is pretty blurry, right? Because I'm focused on looking forward. I'm focused on what's in the center of my vision. So everything out in the margins is more blurry for me. So I don't fully understand everything that's happening there because I can't really see it, or I'm not choosing to see it by turning my head. Once we have marginalized people and we put them out further, it's more difficult for us to understand what is happening in those communities. And that's what is allowing for them to be at a greater risk for exploitation or for experiencing domestic violence. Because if we're not centering them or trying to pull them closer into the center from the margins, well, we don't really care what's happening to them then because we're not even able to see it. So, looking at risk factors for perpetration then. Again, like I stated at the beginning of this, the cause of abuse will always come down to a desire for or a want for power over their partner. But there are some other risk factors that can stem from that specifically. So if they're of a lower socioeconomic status, if they have a low self-esteem, if they have weak sanctions against intimate partner violence. So for example, they don't feel like that their community is actually going to take it seriously. Well, that's one less barrier they have to actually perpetrating harm. If their cultural norms support that aggression, if they're just in their cultural background, it's supporting someone being abusive to somebody else or solving their issues through violence or aggression, well, what's really stopping them from actually doing that? If they have been a victim of physical or mental abuse before, if they have borderline personality traits, or they have a strict adherence to gender roles. So by this, I mean, let's say my belief is that as a man, my role in my relationship is to be the breadwinner. I'm supposed to be the one who makes the decisions, and my partner is the one who's supposed to be at home and does the cooking and the cleaning, things like that. Well, if my partner doesn't want to do that, if they want to go out and work, if they want to go out and make more money than I do, well, I don't quite agree with that because of how I'm viewing the gender roles in that relationship. So I may try to then force my partner into following the gender roles that I have given them. So that strict adherence to gender roles can be a risk factor for perpetrating violence. Now, I'm not saying that gender roles are bad. If both people in that relationship want to follow the gender roles that have been given to them, that is perfectly fine. But you cannot try to force somebody to live in those gender roles if they don't want to. So, question for everyone. What is often the first sign of an abusive or unhealthy relationship?
No, it's not smiling. Closing off.
Sorry, what was that?
Someone like not smiling, isolating themselves, like not talking to family as much.
There's something that comes before that. So you're on the right track, because the first red flag or warning sign is going to be using jealousy to justify their actions, which can then that next step being that isolation or not talking to their family or friends anymore. So I am sure we have all felt jealousy before, and if you haven't, I can pretty much guarantee you will, because jealousy is common. But the important thing to remember is that if our partners are acting jealous or their partners are acting jealous of them, that they can work with them to overcome the jealousy instead of actually having to change the behavior. Because if they have to start changing what they're doing because their partner is jealous of them, that's when it starts to get controlling. So it's the reason I make that distinction of an unhealthy or abusive relationship, because in order to determine an abusive relationship, we need to see a pattern of abuse happening, right? Because we're all human, we're not perfect. We're gonna make mistakes. But the difference is in a healthy relationship, if let's say I act jealous of my partner and she talks to me and I realize like, oh yeah, I was kind of overreacting. I didn't need to be jealous of them. I trust my partner. And I don't do that anymore. Well, I went back to being a healthy relationship, because an unhealthy relationship can go back to being healthy. But the person who is perpetrating the abuse or is using those abusive tactics has to be the one who wants to make that change to go back to being healthy. We cannot make that change for them. So looking then further at the isolation, it's going to be controlling who they do, who they talk to, who they see. So maybe they say things like, oh, now that we're dating, you can't talk to or hang out with other guys or other girls. Or it just seems like every time that they were going to see their friend, they're going to see their family, their partner has an excuse to say, hey, I know we had like Thanksgiving plans with your family, but can't we go spend time with mine instead? Because they know if they can cut them off from these people, they have cut them off from the ones who are the most likely people to help them get out of that relationship. So they're also going to experience emotional abuse. So put downs, name callings, insults, and a lot of victims will end up saying that yes, the physical abuse they experienced, if they did, was bad, but it was the emotional abuse that really led into their self-esteem and left the most lasting scars after that relationship. They might be playing mind games with them, like belittling them or denying the abuse happened that they're saying happened, or blaming that person for the abuse that they're experiencing to begin with. There's going to be humiliation to make them feel bad about themselves. Gift giving with strings attached. And by this, I don't mean they're giving somebody like a yo-yo or a marionette. I mean that they are going to give them a gift, but expect to get something back in return for it. Now, sometimes this could be a sexual favor, but it doesn't have to be. And then threatening to out them. I put this one on here specifically because this allows for that discussion of those social determinants earlier to really start adding into this discussion specifically. Because when we understand someone's identities, it allows for us to better understand what vulnerabilities they may have that their partner could exploit. So using this threatening to out them as an example, if I was gay and I was dating a man, but I am openly out in my community because I know my community is going to support me. I know I have friends and family who will love me and support me regardless. And I know I'm not going to be treated poorly because of that sexual orientation. But my partner doesn't, because my partner is afraid of what their family might do if they end up being out. Or they don't believe that in their community they would have the supports that I do. Well, I can threaten to, I can say, well, if you don't do X, Y, or Z for me, I will out you. That gives me a great deal of power over them now based on my identity and knowing that what social supports I have present, while also knowing what social supports my partner may not have present for them. So there's going to also be intimidation. So abusing pets. Now, how many of you have a pet that's kind of like a family member to you? And then how would you feel if I came over and like, I don't know, just kicked your dog? Are you going to feel like super happy about it? No. And an abusive person knows that. And they're doing it to also send a message to their victim. And they're going to be saying things like, well, look what I can do to this animal. What do you think I could do to you? And it also creates that barrier to leave because, like we said, those animals are like family members, and we wouldn't want to leave a family member in an abusive situation. So if that victim feels like they have nowhere to take that pet, they might stay in that relationship to be there to keep it safe, which is why I point out us having a pet shelter underground. They're going to be breaking or smashing or throwing objects, so taking objects and breaking them. And a lot of victims describe this situation then as an out-of-control fit of rage, where they just don't know what came over their abusive partner. But when we look into it a little more, we see usually only the victim's stuff is ever broken. Hardly ever is the abuser's stuff broken, so it might not have been as out of control as it seemed. They might display or threaten to use weapons, and they may make a victim afraid by using looks or gestures. How many of you have a parent, grandparent, teacher, or coach at some point in your life that could just shoot you a look, and you know as soon as they did, you had to stop doing whatever you were doing? I'm 30 and my mom can still do this to me, so I've realized as we get older, it doesn't change all that much. But the reason that I'm pointing this out is that our parents, grandparents, teachers, coaches, maybe partners in certain situations, they're using that look to let that person know, like, hey, you're doing something that could be dangerous, or you're doing something that's going to get you hurt or make you look dumb, or you're doing something that's not going to be in your own best interests. They're looking out for that person. An abusive person is not looking out for their victim. They're only looking out for themselves, and they're trying to control what that person is doing. The example I use is like when I was when I bought my first house, I was up on the roof, like checking out the gutters to make sure that they were okay. And my parents were over at my house helping me. And as a very lazy person that I am, I get to the edge of the roof about to jump off because that's the quicker way to get down than use the ladder. But before I jump, I see my mom just staring up at me. And I'm sure we all know what look she was giving me because she didn't have to say anything, but I knew that if I jumped off that roof, she was going to hurt me more than the ground. So I had to use the ladder because she was trying to prevent me from doing something stupid. She was looking out for me. An abusive person is not looking out for their victim. There's also going to be minimizing, denying, or blaming. So I mentioned these a little bit a few moments ago, but making light of the abuse or really not taking it seriously. This could be saying things like, oh, they're just blowing it out of proportion, or that it didn't happen that way. Or as an example, we've seen a man on trial say, I didn't hit her that hard. She's just too sensitive. Trying to make it really seem like that whatever their victim is saying is being blown out of proportion, or like the next one, saying that it didn't happen at all, because they want people to believe them and not their victim. Because if people believe them and not their victim, they have made it that much more difficult then for that victim to get the help they need, because if they think no one's going to believe them, why would they bother talking about it? Or then saying things like the victim caused the abuse to happen. Like, well, if you wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have had to hit you. Trying to take blame off of themselves and put it back on their victim to get that victim to start doing things that they want them to do by saying, well, if you weren't doing this, or if you weren't doing X, Y, or Z, this wouldn't have happened. So eventually that victim might change X, Y, or Z in an attempt to get the abuse to stop happening. They may also use the children if they have them. So they might make them feel guilty about the kids by saying things like, well, if you weren't such a bad parent, they wouldn't have done this. Using the children to relay messages. So let's say they're no longer together, but they will constantly be belittling that person to their children to either relay that message back to them or try to cut them off. Oops, messed that up. Sorry. Using visitation to harass them as well, and then threatening to take the kids away. They could also end up doing things in this, like, let's say that they know that their partner has a slight drug problem, or they have made their victim end up having a drug problem. They can then use that against their partner to use that to say like, I'll take the kids away because you're the one who is the drug addict here. Or if they have convinced their partner that they make enough money for the both of them, so now the victim doesn't have a job, well, if they then split from that person who doesn't have a job, it can make it easier for them to try and say like, well, I'll just take the kids because I'm the one with the job. You don't have that. And then for economic abuse leading into that. Just gonna let it ring. Sorry. And then for the economic abuse, preventing them from getting or keeping a job. So this could be either showing up where they work to cause a huge scene to get that person fired, or taking steps to make sure that if they were to get that job, that they'll never move any further in that position by keeping their car out late, so they might always show up late to work. Making them ask for money. So maybe their victim does have a job, but maybe they share a bank account, but only the abuser's name is on the account. So if they ever wanted to spend anything, they have to ask that person for access to that money. Or maybe they only give them an allowance, so they only get a certain percentage of whatever money that they were making. Or possibly harming their education. So let's say they would end up wanting to go to college to start a new career or go into a trade, and their partner says things like, oh, I don't think you'd be very good at that, belittling them to make them lose their motivation for doing it. Or if they actually do go to college or start that trade, doing things to make it so they can't like study for tests, so they end up failing those things, or they can't follow through with assignment deadlines. Because the economic abuse is making it so that their victim is reliant on the abusive partner, and the abusive person wants them to remain reliant on them. So if they get that job, promotion, or education, they might not be reliant on them anymore, and the abuser doesn't want that. Using coercion or threats, so making them making and or carrying out threats to hurt them, threatening to commit suicide, making them possibly drop any charges against them, or making them do illegal things. The example that I like to use for this is, let's say that I am only emotionally abusive to my partner. Well, what eventually happens to someone, or an animal, for example, if they are eventually pushed into a corner? Eventually, they're gonna fight back. So if I can convince my partner through all of the emotional abuse to then try to swing at me, all I have to say is like, oh, I can call the police now and I can get them to arrest you because you're the one who hit me. You're the one who has done the illegal thing now. So this is on you. So trying to really use the law against that person to keep them stuck. And then the reproductive control. So birth control sabotage, so interfering with contraceptive methods to get that person pregnant, to make them feel stuck or trapped to that person. And then once they're pregnant, they can use threats or acts of violence to possibly harm the pregnancy or harm that person. And then continue or then terminate that pregnancy as well. And then privilege. So treating them like a servant or making all the big decisions for the both of them in that relationship, so they're acting like the master of the castle or like the head of the household. And then being the one to define men's and women's roles in the relationship as well. This is strictly for heterosexual relationships. That last one anyway. So why do they do it? Why would someone be abusive? Again, the main reason and the only cause of abuse is because they want to have that power and control. And really stemming out of that specifically then is it gives them that sense of entitlement. It makes them feel more powerful than somebody else. Maybe it is a learned behavior. Maybe they grew up in an abusive household and they saw that their parent was abusive to the other parent. So they learned that that's what a healthy or loving relationship looks like. Again, that is not a justification for why that person is abusive. And them just having it been a learned behavior is not what's actually causing them to be abusive. That causes their wanting power over that person. And then also just because they can. If there's no ramifications for them for doing it and they want to have that power over them, they can do it. So, characteristics of a battering mentality. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but you can kind of see how these are just things that we've already talked about. But the one I want to talk about is the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde part of this, because this plays back into that cycle of abuse discussion we had, where sometimes that partner is going to be super loving and caring, and then just sometimes they're going to be abusive. Because if someone was abusive 100% of the time, they wouldn't be able to keep the person in the relationship. There has to be points where they're going to be loving and caring to show them that they can be a really loving and caring person. It's just sometimes these abusive things pop in. So it's why you end up having victims who say things like, oh, he's only like this when he's drinking, or they had a really rough day at work. Victims will often make justifications for their abuser because that person has shown them they can be really loving and caring. The example that I use is, maybe my friends are just weird, but how many of you have had a conversation with your friends about if one of you needed to get rid of a body, you know who you could rely on, no questions asked. Now, we're not going to make justifications for every murderer, right? Because hopefully we all agree that murder is bad and you shouldn't do it. But if it's our friend, I know my friend is a good person. There had to have been a reason why this happened, so I'll help them out because I know that they're a good person. There had to have been a reason. This is what's happening in that situation. The abuser has shown their victim they can be genuinely loving and caring. And then it's just sometimes the abuse comes in. So, one of the other big misconceptions that we often have around domestic violence or intimate partner violence is that drugs and alcohol can be a cause of it. Because, like I just gave you the example, they're only like this when they're drinking. Well, drugs and alcohol are never going to cause someone to be abusive. Drugs and alcohol lower your inhibitions and may allow for you to do something you might not have done had you been sober. But drugs and alcohol will never allow for you to do something you know you would never do in a million years. Like, if I know to my core that I will never be abusive to my partner, there's no amount of drugs or alcohol I could ever take that would allow for me to do that. Now, if I do become abusive while I'm drinking, I'm just using that as an excuse to try to get away with it. Oh, I was just drunk. I'm sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. Or they'll use it to try to minimize what happened. So why do victims stay? Well, leaving is a process. On average, it takes about 7 times for someone to finally be able to leave an abusive relationship. That means at least 6 times that person will go back to their abusive partner. And there's a lot of examples of why people might stay. Some of that can be the escalation of abuse. They are worried that if they were to leave, that it's going to be more dangerous for them. In part, maybe their partner has told them that, or they tried to leave before and it did get more dangerous for them. Maybe they have a lack of options. They have been cut off from their social supports, so they really have no one to really turn to help them. Or they don't really know what available resources they have for them in their community to begin with. Lack of family or community support, we talked about. Lack of money or status. Maybe the person that they're dating has a higher status in that community. Or maybe they just don't have a whole lot of money, or their partner's controlling all their finances. So even if they were to leave, they don't have the money they need to actually get stuff to help them stay on their own. They might be pressured into staying by peers. So their abusive partner has shown their friends or their family they can be a genuinely really loving, nice, caring person. And then when their victim does start talking about, hey, I think I want to break up with this person or I want to leave them, they'll have their friends and family telling their victim that he's a nice person or that they're a nice person, and I can't imagine them ever doing that. Also, I just realized as I'm saying things, I often will refer to a perpetrator as man or he, and victims as she or a woman. That is not to say that I do not recognize that men are not victims of domestic violence, because they absolutely are. But a majority of victims are women or identify as women, and that is from perpetration by a man. So ends up making the conversation easier as we go through this, where I end up saying like he when I refer to perpetrators and she when I refer to victims, just because that way I'm not throwing out a bunch of different gender pronouns and saying like he, she, they, or they, did this to he, she, they, or they, because that can get hard to follow after a while. Sorry for making that disclaimer 45 minutes into the presentation, but there it is. They may also genuinely love or care about this person, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be dating them. Maybe they have children in common, or maybe their religion is keeping them in the relationship, because maybe they're married and they spoke to their faith leader and they say things like, well, you can't get a divorce because that would be a sin, or that's bad. You've got to figure out how to work on this. So their religion or their faith is keeping them stuck in the relationship. Signs of abuse you can look for. There might be a physical injury or have a bunch of stress-related illnesses. Maybe they have anxiety, panic attack, or stress or depression. Now, again, keeping in mind that one or two of these things is probably not an indicator of abuse, because a lot of us probably have some form of anxiety or stress or depression. But taking all these into account together might raise enough flags to say, oh yeah, something might actually be going on here. Maybe they have drug abuse because they're using the drugs or alcohol to help cope with the abuse that they're experiencing. Maybe they have chronic headaches, like or asthma, or vague aches and pains. They're just like, I just kind of like hurt all over. Abdominal pain or chronic diarrhea. So this from stress specifically. Sexual dysfunction or vaginal discharge, joint pain and muscle pain, sleep or eating disorders. I don't mean you're like me that just has a really hard time sleeping or just stays up and watches football every night and then complains every day that they're tired. There's a very specific reason for that. They may have suicide attempts or have psychiatric illnesses, and then gynecological problems, miscarriages, or chronic pelvic pain. A lot of these can also be related to chronic health issues, those who are experiencing domestic violence, because they are going to have prolonged exposures to trauma. That is going to cause their body to have a lot of stress responses, and a prolonged stress response does lead to chronic health issues. Victims might also appear nervous, anxious, or ashamed. The example I use for this, but I can't really do it because I'm not there. But if I was like standing in front of all of you and I had my arm like pulled in like this, and I'm making myself really small, I would guarantee I lose your attention pretty quickly, because it's called the wounded warrior pose, and you're told not to do it in public speaking because it makes you look nervous, it makes me look smaller, and I'm therefore not commanding attention. Victims of domestic violence might try to make themselves appear to be smaller because they don't want attention on them. They may describe their partner as controlling or prone to anger. Oh, he just has anger problems. They might seem uncomfortable or anxious with their partner present. If they are accompanied by their partner might try to do all of the talking. They give an unconvincing explanation to their injuries. The one that people always say the most is like, oh, I just fell down some steps. Well, if you can kind of imagine what those injuries might look like from what they're saying, and those injuries aren't really lining up, it's kind of a good indicator. Being recently separated or divorced. When someone leaves an abusive relationship, that is one of the most dangerous times for them, because the abuser has lost the control they once had, and they may go to extreme lengths to try and get that back. And they might be reluctant to follow the advice given to them, because the advice is being given to them without taking into account the full picture of what their relationship with this abusive person is looking like. And if that victim was not included in creating that advice or that plan for them, they're not going to follow through with it. So, health implications. I don't need to run through all of these, in part because I got about 9 minutes left with all of you. But again, these are just going to be some of the stuff that they're experiencing because of the abuse. Mainly the ones I want to point out is an inability to trust men, but this could translate to anyone. It can be very difficult for victims of domestic violence to trust other people because the last time they trusted them, especially in that dating relationship sense, they ended up getting hurt by their partner. So some barriers they may have to disclosing. They might fear for their own safety or the safety of their kids or family because their partner has threatened them or others if they did try to leave. They may not believe themselves as a victim because they might not have recognized those early red flags or warning signs. They just are recognizing like, oh, I'm getting like my partner doesn't make me feel super great. And that just happens sometimes. They might have an emotional connection to or love their partner because, again, they genuinely love them because they have shown them they can be a good person. Because an abusive relationship is never going to start out abusive. It will look like any other relationship where they're loving and caring, and then slowly some of the emotional or social abuses will work their way in. Because think about it. If you went on a first date with someone and they just punched you in the face, you're never going out with that person again. But also, if that person on the first date calls you fat or ugly, you're, again, never going out with them again. So they cannot start out abusive because if they did, nobody would date them. The victim may have just be committed to the relationship and they want the relationship to work, which if you're working with someone who is being abused, but they want the relationship to work, don't tell them to just leave or break up with the person. Because one, you're doing the same thing their partner is doing. You're telling them what to do. But also, if they aren't ready to leave that person, then that's up to them. But if you're willing to work with them to help them make a safety plan, to figure out when it does get bad again, what they can do to keep themselves or their kids safer, that is going to be helpful to them. Those are practical things that they can do then when it does get bad. So then eventually, if they do want to leave this person, they know they can rely on you to help them because you were able to help them or give them things before that were actually beneficial to them. They might just hope the behavior will change. They might experience shame or embarrassment. They might be staying for the sake of the kids. They're going to experience depression and stress, some isolation because their partner has cut them off from their friends and their family. A lack of faith in an ability to other people to help them because maybe they have reached out to somebody before and the advice that person gave them was to just break up or leave that person. Well, that's not helpful because maybe they don't want to leave the person yet. So they might just believe that everyone is going to give them that same advice that they got the last time. And they might believe in the value of self-reliance and their independence. So, steps to help victims. Well, address community messaging for one. If an abusive person is consistently receiving messaging that domestic violence is not acceptable, they may be less likely to commit violence because that community messaging is telling them that they are not going to get away with it if they do it. Also using that community messaging to help address the believing of victims. Because if we know we believe victims in our community and victims understand that they will be believed, they may be more likely to report that to their friend or their family, because that is going to be the first person that a victim of domestic violence is going to report to. It's not going to be law enforcement. It's not going to be a social worker. It's going to be a friend or a family member. And if we can educate those in our community that they should be believing victims, well, if that victim has a good response the first time they disclose, they are far more likely to do it again. If they get a poor reaction to them disclosing, or their friend or family says things like just leave the person or break up with them, or they say they would never do that, they've greatly reduced the likelihood that victim ever reports it to anybody else or seeks out services. Make sure it is a multidisciplinary approach, which I know gets thrown around a lot, but understanding what different organizations or businesses can do in order to help address that community messaging. The example I use is people probably don't realize you can also use veterinary offices to help educate and recognize domestic violence. Because if a pet is coming in abused, well, if they're able to also recognize the signs of abuse in humans, if that pet's owner is coming in and is exhibiting some of the similar stuff that the pet is experiencing or exhibiting, that would raise some red flags for them to be able to then possibly provide them with resources or secretively or give them something. So that's kind of what I mean by multidisciplinary approach. Also raise awareness of resources, because if a victim doesn't know those resources are present in the community, they're never going to use them because they don't know they're there. Please absolutely always believe victims, especially if they're talking to you about the abuse they're experiencing directly. Because if they're doing so, that means that they trust you and that they know that you're someone they can rely on. And make sure you always include them in whatever you are providing them. The best response you can give somebody if they disclose to you is, I am sorry that happened to you. What do you need from me? Or what would you like from me? Or how can I help you in this moment? Maybe they just want to talk to somebody about the crappy thing they're experiencing. Or maybe they do genuinely want to leave the person, but they don't know how. So by you asking them that question, you're giving them some of that power back that they might not have in their dating relationship. And then key messaging for victims. You deserve to be safe. Abuse is never your fault. Abuse is likely to escalate. You need a safety plan for staying or leaving. So helping them, again, build that safety plan is going to be helpful to them. You don't have to go to a shelter to get help. You do not need to come into Underground Railroad's Underground Railroad's shelter in order to receive any services.
Hey, Sean, can I interrupt you for just a second?
Yeah.
We have a member who has to leave, but she
Okay.
has a question on where do men go who are violated against? They had 3 patients yesterday who were all victims of domestic violence, and one was straight and violated by a woman, and the other 2 were men who were violated by men. We have she has nothing in her community, and there is anything in your community where men can get help.
Us. So Underground Railroad, we serve victims of all gender identities. So men, women, trans folk, non-binary folk, whoever is a victim can use any of our services completely free of charge. So Underground Railroad is one of them. I know Shelter House in Midland, as well as Bay Area Women's Center or Women's Shelter in Bay City, also serve men as well.
Do you know any in Flint area?
Off the top of my head, no. But I do know that there is a domestic violence shelter down there as well. And I would like to believe that they also serve men. I can look into it for you and email you after this, Rebecca, to make sure. But I will look into that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then your partner has to do the work to change. You cannot make that person change. They have to understand what they are doing is wrong and that they shouldn't be treating their partner that way. All you can do is focus on your own safety and that of your kids as well, if they have kids. So this slide very quickly is just here to help us recognize there are things that we can all do to help address the culture that allows for women and victims of domestic violence in the first place to exist. The way that I explain this is we know most people will never physically harm somebody else. Most of us will never do that, but most all of us, not just men, will do things like telling a young boy that he throws or does something like a girl. Or if I were to ask you how many of you have ever told or laughed at a racist, sexist, or homophobic joke, I would be willing to place large sums of money that most all of us would have to raise our hands if we were being honest with ourselves. Because most of us are doing things like that, we are creating cracks in the foundation of our community that those who would do harm can fill to do that harm. Because if I am in a community where members of the LGBTQ plus community, for example, are consistently being made fun of, and my belief is that they're less than me, well, what's stopping me from bullying them or hurting them? If I was told as a kid that I throw that girls are weaker than me because I hear the messaging, don't throw like a girl, or don't cry because that's what girls do. Well, I am learning as I grow up then that women are not my equal. And if I eventually end up in a relationship with a woman, what's stopping me from going through with her harming that person when I already view that person as less than I am? So if we can address those behaviors that most of us are doing and understand how those things can be harmful, we will eventually see less harm taking place. Because sure, maybe we never fully change that person's belief or values, but what we have done is shown them that this community does not accept it. These are just some resources that you can use if you're looking for more information on domestic violence, or if you ever need to report. And does anyone have any questions for me?
Do we have any questions, anybody? I have one. Will you share your slides with me? So if they
Yes,
want
I'll
some
make
of those
sure.
things, I can.
Yep, I'll make sure I send that to you right after we get off here.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully,
That was great.
hopefully it was useful and what you were looking for.
Thank you. That
It
was a
is.
great presentation.
It is. I'm in Midland and I went to Underground Railroad and did like a tour and everything. That's how we connected you into all of this somehow. But you guys have a great organization there.
Thank you.
I know we're blessed in Midland too, but
Yeah.
it's still nice to know that the neighboring counties for us have have the same resources, so they can be used as well.
Yeah, we also work pretty closely with some of our counterparts over at Shelter House and Bay Area Women's as well.
Yeah, yep.
Like-
and I've sent people to all 3 counties, so.
Like so my counterpart Amanda over at the Bay Area Women's Shelter, she and I have a podcast together. So
Okay,
really trying to create that connection between us as well.
great.
And then, just because everyone absolutely loves doing these, would you guys fill out a survey for me? Because it helps me keep my job, and I like my job.
Yes. My members are usually pretty good about doing that. I'll also add it in a follow-up email, and I can actually add the survey link if you want on the YouTube channel when I share it, because they're going to watch it. They can probably do the survey as well. So I'll make sure I add the survey to the channel.
Cool.
Okay. No worries. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all of you for coming to the meeting. It's been great. Sean, if you want to send me over the slides, I'm more than happy to share those as well with other resources.
Yeah.
Thank you for spending your Wednesday lunch break with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, everyone. Hopefully the information was helpful. And if any of you do ever come up with any questions or just want more information, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the end of the presentation, but also is in the chat as well. So please feel free to ever email me if you have any questions or just need more information or resources. I'd be more than happy to provide you with those things.
Oh, thanks, Sean.
Yep, you're all welcome. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great day.
You as well. Bye.
Thanks, Sean.